Good morning, everybody, to all the participants out there, and good afternoon for people in Singapore, and some good evenings if you're joining from North American region. It's midweek, and exciting to see this support for this webinar from all you guys, and I'm sure it's going to be a cracker of a session, as we have here a very distinguished group of people from engineering leadership. And I'm going to introduce them today before we jump right into our webinar. First, we have with us Jeyandran Venugopal. He goes by Jay. So Jay is the current Chief Product and Technology Officer at Flipkart, one of the leading e-commerce tech giants in India. And he brings a vast amount of experience from his from tech giants like Yahoo and Amazon, to founding his own startup and running for 3 years, to now heading Flipkart at this massive scale of operation, where his core focus is on doubling down on tech investments and preparing for that next level of capabilities across product and tech. Welcome, Jay. We are pleased to have your time here, and I'm sure your insights will be so profound for the young group of innovative engineers who's going to benefit from this webinar, both on the session and on the recorded. Welcome, Jay.
Thank you. Thank you. Pleasure being here.
Yeah, and next we have Mohammed Alabsi. Alabsi is spent a lot of time. He's a seasoned engineering and product leader. I spent more than 12 years, right? Alabsi in Amazon, Seattle, in the States, and he has been some tidbits about him is that he's been part of the founding teams of two of Amazon's biggest 25 billion businesses like ads and Amazon Business, and he's also a very active angel investor in the APAC community and technical advisor. He's also the investor in residence at Insignia Ventures. He was SVP at Bukalapak more recently, so he flew down to the other side of the world in Indonesia and helped scale that startup, and it's one of the biggest e-commerce players in Indonesia right now. Scale it with technical engineering excellence and all that stuff. We'll hear from him. So welcome, Alabsi. Pleased to have you here.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thanks.
And next we have Rajesh Chrandrashekaran. So Rajesh is the VP of Engineering at BukuWarung, and Rajesh is a veteran in the field. He has more than 20 years experience, and he spent long stints at Microsoft, Google, Amazon, pretty much all the FANGs, and he has a strong passion for startups, and especially his current journey is building startups with to that scale with a lot of the engineering excellence and people and culture. So that's what drives Rajesh now. And one of the tidbits about Rajesh is that he was part of the initial Microsoft.NET core team. And he's written some of those class libraries that we use in the Microsoft.NET. This was back in the 90s in Seattle. And I'm sure we'll hear some nice stuff about his early days soon from him. Welcome, Rajesh. Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. Sure. Thanks.
Yeah.
Nice introduction.
Yeah.
Looking forward to have a nice fun conversation with all the leaders.
Yeah. And so guys, our webinar is going to be structured into 3 sections, and but centering really around the core topic of evolution of software architecture, so our microservices and all those good, bad, ugly, right? But let's start with the first section, which will focus on getting insights from our panelists on some of the early career part, right? Like how does it look from those 0 to 3 years stage, and what insights we can take for managing those transitions in the tech world to the engineering leadership, right? So let's start with Rajesh. How does your early days look, Rajesh?
Yeah. I mean, this is actually a very fond question for me, because when you start out your career, you are filled with enthusiasm and excitement. You're looking forward. So one thing I really found is early on, you want to be learning a lot, churning a lot of code, contributing as much as you can, trying to absorb as much information that's possible, because those are your early years, those are your foundational years, right? So as much as you can come in, contribute, and try to make a difference, and then slowly, you immerse yourself in different things. And if you start to become that person who's able to pull projects through, the kind of person who's your manager can count on, and slowly you start to manage yourself and also contribute in design. You grow. I think the first few years are really exciting because there's not a lot of accountability. You're slightly more free. This is the time to learn, and that's kind of what my experience was, and that's kind of what I did.
Fantastic. And how was your transition to being like, from this fresher stage career to the lead level? Can you share some insights there? How did you actively plan for that, or it just happens? Tell us about how those things work.
Yeah. So I think before you can really think of being a lead, the first few years, you do need some guidance. It's early years, but slowly you get the hang of it. It's like a repeat and rinse. You do a few of these cycles. You go through a few product life cycles, and you start to manage yourself. So you can't really think of being a lead till you can actually manage yourself. And only when you manage yourself and able to take care of the things, then you can think of managing or leading others. So some learnings for me, at least, that were that someone who was a very strong IC was able to hold myself accountable, deliver results, and so you become like a person who can be trusted on. And slowly, as you're able to do that, you're able to influence others, and leading by example, leading with influence versus authority. And so once you start doing that, that's kind of when you are starting to be the person who can be looked upon to lead.
Understand. That's good. And so let's hear from Alabsi. He had his first stint with a startup, and then a very long tenure with Amazon, AWS. How did your transitions go, Alabsi? Was that like, did you do a reset when you moved to a big company, or what were those skills that you acquired from early stage startup? Can you share some stuff there?
Absolutely. So I was quite fortunate to have managers who were great mentors during my career. And one of the best pieces of advice that I got was to treat myself as a startup and to frequently evaluate my skill set and where my career is going, and look for opportunities to grow. So while I was a senior in AWS, I decided to kind of expand my scope of curiosity as well as contribution, and kind of understand a bit more what are the needs of the organization and the needs of the business. And I kind of was very proactive in having one-on-one conversations with product managers. I reached out to a couple of high VPs to better understand the goals and the vision of the organization. And I actually jumped on calls with my peers in customer support and the sales team to kind of hear firsthand from our customers what were some of the challenges and the pain points that they had. And I think that insight gave me a very fresh perspective on what it takes to build a successful organization, and how can I contribute to the success of the organization beyond just basically writing code. And that set the stage up very nicely for me to be able to help on sourcing and interviewing, coaching and mentorship, coming up with new product ideas that were eventually on the product roadmap and became patents themselves. And all of that eventually contributed to the improvement of the experience of our customers. So if I have one piece of advice for folks early in the career that they want to grow to become more effective leaders, is to not be constrained by the current job description, to try to push the envelope, to be proactive in helping their teammates, their organization, and to better understand the needs of their business. And always innovate and think on behalf of your customers. And I think, if that's done well, success and career growth is going to follow.
Wonderful, wonderful. So basically keep your focus and mentoring others really helps here, right? Looks like really you have to shift your mode into, hey, how can I make things better by helping others, right? Even though technically you're not having those tags like lead and all, right? Is that something, but do you feel like, there are boundaries there? Like, do you feel like there are differences in how some organizations would pursue this? Have you anything quick to share there with respect to being able to contribute outside your scope, for instance? How would that be seen?
Yes, I mean, different organizations have different cultures as well as different needs. So you want to be, you want to have the understanding of basically where your team and where your organization kind of needs you, and kind of try to keep that in mind. But I would say something that is a bit more universal across pretty much everywhere that I've worked is that to be a leader, you're kind of expected to be a multiplying factor for people that work with you and be able to drive influence that way. So, basically helping out your teammates, the people that you partner with at work, and being proactive in addressing customer needs is something I would say that's been fairly appreciated and fairly welcomed pretty much everywhere that I've been.
Yeah, I understand. And so basically, Rajesh, what would be one key skill that you would pick, like, for succeeding in a lead role and positioning yourself for like fast growth in that track?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. See, I think if you're going to continue to want to grow as a lead, the question is in which direction. Some people decide they want to continue remaining the IC track, others want to do maybe in the managerial track. But you have to also understand that you will not scale right beyond a certain point. So you need to really look at mechanisms to scale. So one way could be, for example, how do you delegate and how do you do it effectively, especially if you're trying to go down the managerial path. What made you successful as a lead? You were great IC, you did more and more of that, but there's only so much bandwidth that you have. So you have to know when to step in and when to step out, and have mechanisms possibly to say that, okay, like maybe sometimes you need to double click and go really deep, and sometimes you need to just look at it from a distance. So being able to dial it up or down is something very important. And this is a skill you need to build as a lead also, because as you scale up as a lead and you manage larger and larger teams, you're not going to be possible for you to be in the middle of everything, right? So you have to figure out, maybe you need to coach the next level of leaders to grow them, right? So the balancing act becomes very important.
Yeah, I mean, delegation is a very key skill. And we've also seen that, it's important in engineering management, like Alabsi mentioned, that, being that multiplying factor to that team's performance, right? You want to really be the person who amplifies that, not just one-to-one, or you delegate and somebody does it, but with respect to like, hey, how can you make people do 2x, right? In the time, I mean, it's not about overworking, but how do you get that whole effect as a team to be greater than the sum of its parts? So that's a very interesting perspective there. And so let's hear from Jay. Jay, what about your early days? And could you also share a bit on that multiplying effect and how it can shape engineering leadership careers better?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think talking about my early days, I joined a startup called Amazon. So now mentioning Amazon and startup in the same sentence, maybe.
Wow, wonderful. This is amazing. Yeah.
That kind of, I guess, dates me badly as well, but nevertheless, I think it was in a stage where Amazon was still a startup, right? So it was basically my association with Amazon began in the summer of 2000 when incidentally the .com bust was playing out, right? So, and Amazon was already a public company, but it had gone public within a couple of years of its founding, right? So it was still very early, less than 1,000 people. Remember right, in the engineering org at that time, 1,000 or somewhere in that ballpark, right? So it was pretty small company, at least by today's standards when you look at Amazon, right? So I think one thing I would definitely suggest, and I don't claim that I knew all of this ahead of time, and then therefore I miraculously followed a path of wisdom. Some of these things are in hindsight, and I was just lucky enough to have landed some of these things, right, that helped me in my career. So I think landing in a very, very high growth phase company, typically that happens in startups, but need not always be, right? It could also be that even a large company could be growing at exponential phase if the market and the conditions are right, but more often than not, it happens in startups, right? So, landing in a very high growth phase company gives you a lot of opportunity to explore your boundaries a lot more freely, right? You don't have actually any limitations of having to stick to only one thing. In fact, in a startup, people are generally looking to see, hey, can you double hat, triple hat, and whatever you can handle, you are free to handle, right? So there is no constraints placed on you. So that really is something that is really helpful in early days. The other thing also that worked very well for me is that I had a great set of mentors, right? So always find really good mentors from whom you will learn the craft on the field. You may have done the greatest coursework from the best colleges out there, and so on and so forth, right? So, but actually seeing some of this in action in real world settings with all the ugliness and beauty of what a real world setting brings to a problem statement, and being able to develop your skill there can, in my opinion, happen only through significant level of learning by seeing, right? Working with great people, working with mentors that you really respect and trust, and who are also vested in your growth as a professional, right? So that's something that I really was very fortunate to enjoy. And I would definitely advise any early career person to look at that as a key component of how they decide what to do, where to go, what to work on, and so on. And continuous learning is a very important thing. I remember, at least in our early days, in like late 90s, early 2000s, I mean, it's only 21 years earlier, but it feels like a lifetime before, right? So there at that time, you learn something, you can use it, reuse it, like the famous kind of rinse and repeat protocol, right? Like you learn, let's say, I still remember protocols like Corba, for example. You learn it and then you can keep on using it. Every company, there'll be some things where you're doing Corba. And then when from there you switch to a PubSub based protocols and architectures, that was a big thing in the industry, and that's something that happens once every decade, right? Today, every year you get obsolete, right? If you're not up to date, if you're not keeping yourself invested in learning new things, what you learn today will not be relevant 2 years from now, right? So I think even in those days, I used to feel that continuously investing in learning is very important. Today, it's like triply more important, right? Or like exponentially more important. Yes. So I would say those are the things you should invest on. To your question on basically the delegation and the transitioning of basically from an individual contributor, technical lead to somebody who can multiply the goodness and delivery coming out of a team of people working with you. I think it's not that it's the only career path anybody should or could choose for growing. That's also a popular misconception that if I have to actually become grow in my career, quote unquote, then I need to grow from a tech lead to a manager, right? And start doing people management. You need to do what you enjoy, right? So I, for instance, realized early on when experimentally my manager at the time said, hey, why don't you take on this people management role and see whether you like it? I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I'm happy. Why are you asking me to do things that I'm not comfortable? So he really said, look, unless you try, how would you know? And he said that looking at you and how you operate, how you interact with people, I feel like you will do even better there. So why don't you give it a shot for me? And in 6 months, if you tell me you're not cut out for it, I'll respect that and let you go back to being an architect. So I took this on. I realized there was some wisdom in his words. I really like the element of working with people, enabling them, mentoring them where I can with whatever knowledge I had gained until that point of time, and being able to infuse business understanding into problem statements and create the right solutions. Right. So in terms of how you make a decision in your career, it's a very personal thing. You need to figure out what is it that really excites you, what makes you excited every day when you get up in the morning to come to work. If you say,
so it's important that ultimately you can have all these prescriptions, right? Hey, do this, fast track career, everything. But if you really don't enjoy it, if you don't enjoy being like quote unquote pulled in different directions, right? You have different things. And really, like you said, you guys have said that mentoring is important, right? So finding the right mentor who kind of helps you identify the right things in the company, correct? As you transition from your early career to the different stages, correct? Because I believe that in like growing startups, there is always like space for adapting to different people's styles, right? And getting some carving out something where it's unique to the individual's growth as well as contributing to the company, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, fully agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So thanks, guys. I think this was very insightful on like, how the early career and what are some of the things that people should take to transition to lead and key things to grow beyond that. Let's transition now to like evolution of software architecture, right? And let's look at it in the context of microservices, the good, bad, ugly, and so invariably, when all startups basically start out with a business need, right? Like there's something that the founders identified, there's a market need, or maybe not, you need to vet it out. So at that point, you really are worried about getting the product market fit. And so your code base looks really like a single deployment, and they call it like a monolith, right? Like a single big, maybe a Java Spring project or like, a Python deployment. And that's functional at that stage. And we'd love to hear your insights, guys, on what are the motivations for transitioning beyond this to like a SOA or microservices world. And let's hear from your specific experiences at whatever stage in career you had to like fight battles around this. Rajesh, you want to start on this? Like, share your experiences in this?
Yeah. So, I mean, I completely agree with what you said. Like, generally, software is born in some business context, right? You're not just building software for the sake of building software. Hopefully, you're trying to solve a business problem, unless you consciously said you want to be some kind of a platform. So the thing is, software is also like an organism, right? It kind of grows and it evolves, and your business constraints and context also change. But when we try to look at it from the lens of SOA, I think, let's say, for a fintech service, for a fintech company, if I was trying to build software, maybe I have common problems, like maybe KYC could be a problem, right? So if I wanted to do it, there might be multiple squads in my company that are trying to build similar solutions. So I'll probably build it as a service that is shareable. And the other thing could be something like an authentication scheme. So these become good candidates to think about. So even though we're thinking about monoliths, you also need to start looking at things that you're not reinventing the wheel. So that becomes a very important part of it to consider. The other dimension also, I've seen like companies look at is, there's only a point at which you can scale in terms of vertically scaling. At some point, you scaled up your app servers, you try to scale up your database at some point, and then things are starting to kind of get slower and slower. So, and I'm sure there are experts who can scale up vertically, but at some point you really need to start to see that, okay, is this a good time to step back and say, can I use something like people term in the industry called domain-driven design around like the business context, and try to split it up into different parts so that you can kind of be decoupled and try to slowly start getting in the early days of separation of concerns, so that you can also split out your logic into multiple parts that can scale independently. And at this point, you're starting to separate out your DB, your caches, and all that. But you get into this interesting point: should you really go down like the SOA route, or should you kind of go down the microservices, and microservices take it to like the next level of granularity? What is it? The right choice is an interesting point of discussion itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and from my personal experience as well, right? So let me summarize for our audience here that SOA and microservices, there's a lot of different terminologies, things you find on the web, right? It's not like hard and fast, but generally let's define SOA as an idea of taking functionality sets and grouping them into services, right? Just one step of removing the madness of a single monolith. And microservices world as something where you, like I just shared, taking it to an entirely different level of granularity, where each deployable unit, like let's say a Python Flask, right? Microservice will have its own database, its own cache, and it can be deployed independently. And what you have to do is just make sure that this service, whatever small thing it's supposed to do, it's able to be independently tested and being able to plug it into the other hundreds of services, right? And so when you set this kind of a definition, it brings us like, some of the challenges, because when you have independent deployable units like this floating around, whether it's your Kubernetes or you're doing directly on AWS or GCP. So what that brings up is like, things like uptime, SLAs, and monitoring, right? How do you know whether one of your 100 services is the weakest link in the chain? So that's a very interesting challenge. And I'd love to hear from Alabsi in this experience, because he's moved from a big microservice champion like AWS, right, into Bukalapak. And at that point, it was a very early stage venture there, and it's growing at breakneck speed. How was Alabsi's transition, and some of the other like technical plus the business aspects of messaging out this kind of change, Alabsi? Please share your experiences in Indonesia specifically with this.
Absolutely. When I joined Bukalapak, and for folks who don't know, Bukalapak is one of the largest and the early pioneers in the e-commerce and the startup stage in Indonesia. Bukalapak started as or the platform Bukalapak started as a monolith and continued to do so for some time. And at some point we decided to move some of the new product development to microservices, but we still have a good chunk of our development that happened on the monolith application. But also, as that monolith application grew and as the size of the business grew, we had a set of monolith database clusters that were growing at even a faster pace. These were massive databases. Think about 21, 27 nodes, 2 terabytes of data each, and at the scale and the speed of the growth of the data, as well as the sizes of the cluster, it became quite a challenge to make sure that the platform continues up. So our immediate priority was to ensure that we can make the necessary changes to make sure that our databases and database clusters can scale. Think about partitioning, data compression, caching, some query optimizations as well. And then from there, we went through and championed a massive effort across the organization to break down the application themselves into microservices. And once we got the buy-in and we communicated, I guess, the value that investment is going to bring to the organization as well as to the team, we had a core group of engineers that kind of spearhead this effort across the organization, with each of our tribes had its own migration goals that they're trying to work with. And within 2 years, we were fortunate to migrate most of the functionality out of the monolith. Of course, there was basically a lot of challenges in making sure that we do this migration successfully, but also making sure that we don't have, we reduce the downtime as much as possible, because we were still a fast-growing business. We had tens of millions of customers who visit Bukalapak on a daily basis. So making sure that we drive these improvements, that we keep track of the metrics in terms of SLAs, but also see the potential impact from this effort on the reduction of latency, reduction of error rates was something that was quite exciting to see.
Yeah, if I may interject here, just a relevant question. So when do you decide to bell the cat, right? I mean, things are happening, business is moving, right? So when do you actually decide? As engineers, we know, okay, fine, this is not going to be sustainable, everything is going to collapse in a heap. But when do you actually bell the cat and talk to business and say, hey, guys, we need to invest in this parallel effort of microservice breakdown, like you said, and how do you communicate that out? Like, something very, very brief, like, could you share that?
Absolutely. So we really depended on a bunch of metrics that we had that we were tracking on the engineering side, and we kind of compared, we kind of mapped them or converted them into business impact. So we looked at some of the metrics that we looked at included latency, error rates, how how quickly we develop our products and features, our cycle time and lead time for each of the products and the features that the team has worked on, and then kind of came up with intelligently calculated estimations in terms of what is the impact on all of these metrics, all of this metrics, if we end up making this investment. And then, that way it becomes a bit more clear what is the value proposition that this particular investment is providing to the business and to the customer experience if we're able to do it successfully. And I think by communicating it that way.
Great. Hey, thanks so much, Alabsi. That was a wonderful description of how things happened at Bukalapak. And Jay, let's hear from you, right? So you, like you said, started with Amazon, and you would have seen some breakdown there, simply like not on this, and some lessons from your job. Not all rosy, right? As it looks, we need to provide that perspective. So let's transition into that after your experience.
Sure. I'll actually talk through some examples that may address some of the questions that you had raised earlier to Alabsi as well, on how do you time it right in terms of when you do this, and how do you communicate this to business. So I'll give you some real examples from my very early on career, and also some around the so-called ugly side of microservices if you don't manage it well. Buy-in of the microservices architecture with their AWS services. So if you can believe it, the early Amazon was actually a single monolithic binary. So basically there was a C++ binary called Obidos, and then there was a Perl framework that monolith was running the entire Amazon web store, right? And the entire thing was one thing. Even today, if you go on to Obidos, be prepared to close your ears for half an hour, because they'll go on a rant at you. And stop so I think from that time, leading technology at Amazon at that early days was one of the proponents of Al Vermeulen, was the CTO, or the kind of the chief architect / CTO. And so they basically said, we want to transform this company into a service-oriented architecture. But a mandate from a technology office or things very fast, right? And you already have a monolith, and it is working, quote unquote, in some way, right? So one way that, for example, B was available, like I still remember, for example, in very early on days, this also, I don't know how many people remember, Target's first web presence, target.com, was actually done by Amazon. Amazon offered it as a service to basically, and we were actually closely involved in that project, and there was a choice, right? So obviously, any of these NPIs, new program initiatives coming from Jeff Bezos' office was always priority, right? So it had to be done as quickly as possible. So there was so then when we looked at it, there was a cards and their proprietary payment methods, and to do it in our existing monolithic code base. And there was some lib financial service, I still remember, not very fondly, of all the struggles with. If you were to use that opportunity to refactor it out and then create a service out of it and make payments as a standalone separate API based service, then you would have taken, let's say, 2x time, right? So we MVP and something else, right? So clearly there was a time to market need, and there is a phase one landing that the program managers and business folks were trying to optimize. So we said, okay, while there is this delta, first of all, we are not the bottleneck, right? So there are other teams that are the bottleneck. So this may add only incremental time. But if we do it this way, going from MVP to the next version will take us this much more time, whereas in this new architecture, it would take this much less time. Right? And availability guarantees that we can give on you on the old architecture is 99.9, whereas on this one, it is 99.99, right? So we put the trade-offs in front of them and then convince them that this is the way to go, even if it meant that you put in some additional effort to do the refactoring and servicing. So that is something that we did successfully. And this
that Jay actually incidentally answers one of the Q&A questions, because I'm interjecting this at the right time. someone had Gunjan had this question that, should you always, when you have a greenfield project that that you're experimenting your company with, and you always start with the monolith and break it down into microservice, or basically start off with microservice initially. And I think what you're talking was very relevant there, right? So basically it's about presenting the pros and cons at that situational, right? There's really no right or wrong answer here, right, Jay? Is that something we could summarize for us broadly?
Yeah, that sounds about right. You also asked me a question about the pitfalls of microservices and what you need to watch out for. Do you want me to talk about that as well briefly?
Yeah. So in this context, maybe so between monolith in companies, right? But you also have hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah. Hey.
Yes, we can.
Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear.
Yes.
We can hear you.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I got it. Yeah. So yeah, we will go into that. But before that, so these decisions between monolith and services in companies, it's really based on the situational, correct?
Yeah, I think in very early stage, when you're getting started with trying to find product market fit, trying to decompose your architecture very early on, may or may not be entirely useful, because there are complexities around managing a highly distributed architecture with a large footprint, APIs, endpoints. You need to worry about things like having the right service mesh architecture for service discovery, scaling, and all that, right? So there is some additional complexities you need to manage, especially for a mid to large size enterprise. If you're also, and I mean, these days, even small size enterprises have to look at privacy and security by design, right? So having a large decomposed architectural footprint increases some of the complexities of how you secure the architecture, right? So the network becomes more complex. The east-west traffic, meaning the inter-service chatter, which is called as east-west traffic, becomes a little bit more complex to comprehend, unless you put investments into meta services that gives you visibility, that and things like AI ops, for example, right, to be able to do correlation and causation analysis when there is a breakdown in your very complicated service graph now and all that. It becomes a bit difficult to handle it, right? So I think before you have achieved strong product market fit and you are experimenting a lot, I would say perhaps the trade-off is not entirely worth it. But even when you're doing the monolithic architecture, if you keep in mind that if this achieves product market fit and we need to rapidly scale, we need to take the existing components and be able to break it down reasonably quickly and keep that design principle in mind while you're creating a single deployment service. Then that makes the transition easier. So you can get the best of both worlds of the ease of managability by creating a single bundle service, while paving the way for being able to scale it rapidly, horizontally, by architecting it the right way. One of the elements I'll also add is one of the anti-patterns that you can see in services, even if it is service-oriented, is called a God component, right? So what that means is, whenever business requirements come, if you're always in the position of having to touch a particular code base, a particular service, then that is the anti-pattern called God component, right? So this is architectural debt that you're paying. And that means that you will have to look at refactoring that and further and go more on towards isolation of concerns, right? So those kind of things keep in mind while you design the architecture, and do it at the right time, along with the accessory components that are required to manage it well.
I think the way you put it really tips it, man, right? You can also showcase business outcomes very quickly, get it as a monolith, but at the same time, be very clear, that articulative, that, hey, this is going to be built in a way that's going to make it easy to, as we scale, to move. So thank you so much, Jay, for that. And let's move into the pitfalls, right? The top of the line pitfalls would be, hey, you need really to monitor, right? You have so much east-west traffic. You need to provide all those monitoring and circuit breakers and stuff. So can we go into some specifics on the pitfalls and share from your experiences, right? Some horror stories, perhaps, of moving too fast into microservices or not being prepared, right? And some of the lessons that other people can, we have more than 200 people right now that they can take away, something like a crux that, hey, do's and don'ts, right? Or stay away from this. Yeah, anything, Jay, you want to start off?
Yeah. I think I covered a little bit of that earlier. I'll elaborate a bit more on that, right? So the first, in sense of scaling, right? So see, I think when you decomposed your entire landscape of services into fairly fine services that give you isolation of concerns, it also means that scaling each of these individual clusters along with maybe you have a 2-tier or a 3-tier architecture for each of those separate microservices themselves, depending on the vertical scale that you want to achieve within that microservice. It is almost impossible to do manually, right? Your operational overhead becomes extreme if you don't invest in constructs like auto scaling and all of that stuff, right? So there is some self-healing systems that optimize for your OpEx as well, right? Otherwise, if you always over provision your cluster capacity, then you will incur a high OpEx cost. So that is one element, right? The other one is configurability and discovery of endpoints and so on and so forth, right? So in a regular service-oriented architecture where the decomposition is not very extreme, you could always configure your dependent services by hand with named endpoints on the ELBs and so on and so forth, right? You cannot do that easily with a really microservicized architecture, and you need to invest in service mesh constructs, right? So that discovery of dependent services is almost automatic.
Got it. So in that sense, so Jay, not to cut you off, but let's hear from Rajesh and Alabsi also very quickly before we transition into the next section on this one. So Rajesh, in a very brief level, right? Anything you'd like to add to this whole pitfalls microservices concept, right? Anything that is keep in mind kind of a thing, right?
So I've been also watching the questions.
Again, we got about 15 more minutes, so we need to quickly wrap this up and then move into the next section, right?
Got it. Yeah. So I'll give an example. We did one of the startups at InMobi. When we started out, also it was like we built like we had a monolithic ad server. Over time, kind of refactored into multiple parts, and we did it as you needed to, right? Very much along the lines, of the ROI. You started with the monolithic, you have these services, and you kind of slowly evolve, right? But one thing that early startups have is they don't write unit tests. The culture of unit tests is not there. And if you guys have read Martin Fowler's Microservices, No Free Lunch, which I'm sure most people would have, unit tests become extremely important, right? And so the culture tends to be something that people want to move faster and faster. Obviously, there are a lot of these moving parts and the machinery that Jay already covered about. But if you don't have unit tests, what happens is the logic or the context that is captured which was there in one monolithic slowly started getting distributed, right? So if you have a very small team of 2 people, right, you have the context right there, you're able to build it out. But as you start to separate it out, at some point you realize when you have thousands of services, and I've seen this at Amazon, where the left hand no longer knows what the right hand is doing. Like, you ask anybody what is the state of the system, there is no single person who can actually
and recreating it in staging. And recreating it in staging is going to be even more complex. Nobody knows how to recreate production, right? So in that sense, unit tests, great. So have strong unit tests, make sure that you build it from bottom up, great. And Alabsi, anything like that, like, we got about a minute before we move to the next section, Alabsi. Anything that you share, pitfall kind of a thing, right? Like top of the line, right? Hey, keep in mind kind of a thing for our participants today.
Sure thing. I would say maybe a couple of things to add on. I've seen, some teams where they get super excited about microservices that they move to what I call ANA services, where they go so granular, where each of the microservices is composed of a single class, maybe like a single API and like a single table, and like you kind of, if you go to that degree and you kind of, or if you go to that extreme and you overdo it, then you're introducing a lot of complexity in your platform without really gaining a lot of the value. So domain-driven design, I think, is super helpful to allow you to figure out to what degree or what is the right granularity level for you in terms of figure out what code should kind of stay and live where. That's one. The second is to, as the number of deployments that you have increases and grows, it's really important to invest in automation, and that's I believe something Rajesh has touched on as well. So, CI/CD pipelines, auto scaling, Kubernetes to manage all of your deployments, metrics and monitoring
be
across the board.
clear. Yeah. So if I may summarize for you, it's like, be very of domain-driven different design kind of things that you can use and invest in good automation, CI/CD, right? Because if you have so many deployment units floating around, it just becomes unmanageable to scale all those microservices, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So great, guys. I think this has been a very useful section here, and keep it coming, guys. So some of those questions there, we'll revisit anything specific on the pitfalls, things to watch out for the participants. Let's cover the last part. I think there's a lot of Q&A also coming in with respect to this section, and this is one of my favorites as well. I call it plunging into the startup journey, right? We have a lot of young, innovative software engineers on the call today, and some are in startups already, some are contemplating the plunge. So all of you guys, panelists, have had solid careers at tech MNCs and then got into startups and been very successful. So what are some of the motivations to transition to tech startups? And in this section, let's cover a bit on, between starting out in big tech and then coming into startups versus few startup first in your career. What are some of the gotchas or things you would need from startups to kind of get that when you scale, right? Get that experience. So Rajesh, what was your motivation? Because you had a very long stint at like some of the biggies, and then of late you've been passionate about startups. So could you summarize some of your motivations and any takeaways for our group here?
Yeah. I think one thing that really stands out to me in startups is the energy levels go through the roof. And it's very exciting, vibrant kind of environment, lots of things happening. Jay also touched upon some of these things earlier, that a lot of the things are not so well defined. Now you can look at it two ways. You can look at it as an opportunity, or you can say, hey, these are all broken, right? And the learning opportunity is like immense, right? So, if you spend like X years in a startup, that is equal to maybe 3 to 4x of time spent in a large organization. That's that burst of learning, career, and the number of things that you get to solve is not comparable in large organization. Things are a lot more set. So for me, that is like the lure to kind of do it from the grassroots.
Nice.
And understand.
So you really want to be in the thick of things, right? Yeah. What about foosball tables, Rajesh? Are you lured by foosball tables of startups? just kidding, man. Like usually you see that the startups have this vibe about just being more dynamic, right? Is that? I mean, of course, large corporations also have that vibe, but like you said, yeah, totally. Jokes apart.
The other interesting things are obviously you might get to build things from scratch, right? You'll get to add value in a large organization for sure, but it'll probably be more incremental, right? Yeah. So that's the other big lure. So you find that because you're building things from scratch and solving the things your competency wise and from a career point of view for an engineer, you get to learn a lot more, right?
And Jay, from Alabsi, right? I'll come to Jay. Alabsi, for you, from your AWS to Bukalapak, how was that? Like, because that was like really much early stage, right? You just jumped right into something on the cusp of breakout. As far as market, so Indonesia, right? I mean, a growing market, e-commerce, but technically at that scale, there weren't, I think, many such operations back in Indonesia back then. So you really took the plunge, right?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I did. It was a very interesting time to join Bukalapak because it was this very fast growing organization. It's growing in all kind of metrics, and it's going through this phase where it's transitioned from a scrappy, small, young startup to like a maturing startup that is and going through some of the challenges and some of the growing pains that go along that. And it was kind of an interesting time where you want to try to find the right balance between establishing enough processes in place where you can, make some of, where you can manage some of the operations a lot more efficiently, reduce the number of mistakes and errors, and drive that feedback loop internally within the within the team such that, we continue to grow and improve, but also at the same time not have too much processes that you take away a lot of that speed that the business and the organization required at the time. So introducing some of the processes that that we had, like root cause analysis, change management, to name a few, were important to make sure that we have some structure in place such that we can move fast, but we can be a bit careful of how we do that to ensure that we continue to provide great experience for our customers.
Yeah, I'll come back to this. Just wanted to interject with Jay here, right? So Jay, did you have a mirroring experience, or like, a quick, comparison between like, what Alabsi has seen, and you also had like, you founded your own startup, and then, and maybe Myntra, I don't know what stage it was in when you picked on, right? Do you want to share something in that context? And then we'll get back to Alabsi. Hello, Jay?
Yes.
Yeah, you're unmuted now. Yes.
Largely, I think mirrors a lot of the experiences that Alabsi talked about in terms of what you would typically find transitioning from one to the other, right? So what I would suggest is, again, reiterate what I mentioned earlier when we were discussing another topic. I think in terms of the levels of visibility and transparency you have on all aspects of the business, and clearly in a smaller startup, the opportunities are more ample for that, which can help you get a larger canvas within which you could actually do exploration, right? So you could explore your interests a little bit more widely. Typically in a larger setting, larger company setting, especially a setting, I mean, I shouldn't say larger company was a small company. I should say typically in a high growth company versus not so high growth company, which is kind of in a bit of a plateau or a small, like a rate of growth, which is not exponential, right? You would see that the rate at which opportunities open up for you, your ability to go grab new things to do can become a bit limited, right? In a much smaller setup or a high growth setup, you would actually see that today, for example, especially in early to mid part of your career, you would see that, look, I want to explore my interest in product management. I want to explore my interest doing some data analytics and data science kind of roles, right? So doing this in large companies typically involves a larger process, a transition plan, and some sort of things like that, right? Like in a smaller company, your ambition is your own limitation, right? Like you can do whatever you want as long as you're able to put in your commitment and show that you're able to do something meaningful there, right? So that is one thing I would definitely call out. Yes, I think you need to adapt to a different way of working. If you're very used to actually fairly defined work processes and priorities not changing, typically in a high growth company, especially in a hyper aggressive, hyper competitive market, etc., which typically go hand in hand, right? Like unless there is that market dynamics, you won't have a very high growth startup, right? So in those kind of cases, I would say you would have those possibilities of getting a little bit of creative chaos, so to put it, right? And being able to thrive in that is very important for talent.
Yeah, that's a good point. And Alabsi, this creative chaos thing, right? Like in startups, do you find that it's inevitable that you have to go through that stage, Alabsi, of that creative chaos where you have to accept that this is right? I mean, you're doing something right if that comes, correct, Alabsi?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is a stage that I've experienced in basically the startups that I've seen successful and I've seen grow, and I think managing that and kind of making the best out of it is something that's quite important for startups to be quite successful. And just to echo on what Jay has said, this brings in a lot of opportunity for people who are part of fast-growing startups to find opportunities, and there's plenty of them, to find opportunities for them to contribute, to make an impact, and as a result, drive their career growth as well.
So, Thank you. And one question to Rajesh. I think we discussed a bit about mentorship and all. So have you seen that, in startups, like, can you talk about how mentorship becomes very important? There's also some of the questions from the Q&A as well. Just putting up here. Can you talk about, like, when you jump into startups, when you go there, how important is mentorship in the startup to be able to get the good flavor or experience? Because everything in startup world, we can't say it's good or bad, right? So there's a lot that depends. So Rajesh?
Yeah. So excellent point. I think LSP also alluded to this earlier in the conversation on mentorship. So at least at BukuWarung, what we do is we make sure when there is like a new joinee coming in, we make sure they have a buddy, they feel settled in, it's easy, and then we also make sure that they are paired up with like a tech lead so that they get the relevant mentorship. We also set them up for for instance, for like continuous learning. We do these weekly or like bi-weekly learning sessions. We also have like these design reviews, where someone can come and present their ideas so that you can learn from each other, you can get feedback from senior folks. So we have all these kind of guardrails in place so that people can come in, can realize their full potential. I'm sure other organizations also do something similar, but these are some of the mechanisms I've found which really make sure that continuously people are coming in and they are given the guidance and the help that they need to grow, and they're able to realize the potential. Because the one of the lure, I think, for also joining a startup is to make sure that you have an accelerated career, right? And it's not possible without shaping the diamond. Literally, that's what it is. Because when people come in, they come in with raw talent, and I think the mentors are extremely important. So I think that was also covered by the other folks.
Thank you. Yeah, so now I'm going to basically start going into some of the pure Q&A mode, right? So we can get some real questions. I think a lot of those questions I've already covered through the session. So it's not like it's going to be exclusive Q&A, but more specifically, some questions on how do you, let me pick something that's more relevant. Yeah, working for in Indonesia, right? Regional startups. Like, is there anything like local flavor, Alabsi, that you see working for startups catering to Southeast Asia or Indonesia, those kind of regions, versus this, or basically tech is tech and everybody is one?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a very exciting time to be operating in this region at this time. There's fantastic growth. There's a lot of opportunities, and like when you look at a market like Indonesia with 280 million people, there's a large percentage that are currently unbankable, and there's a massive opportunity to drive innovation and impact on people's lives through technology, and in part, some of these technical problems are somewhat the same compared to other markets, but also in part that the customer needs what customers like, and the trends are a bit different as well. So, for example, it's good to take some of the insights from successful technology companies or startups from more metro markets and apply it in Indonesia or in Southeast Asia in general. But you can't just simply copy and paste. There has to be some kind of adoption to the local needs that will complement that, and will make sure that a person's idea or a person's startup is going to be better suited or better positioned at addressing the customer's needs.
Okay, great. Thank you, Alabsi, for sharing experiences from your sharing your insights from your experience. I think there are a lot of questions that can be bucketed into, like, what metrics should be tracked to improve the measurement? Like, when people move to microservice architecture, right? There seems to be a lot of like this, like we discussed, right? The cons of it. So they're looking for some metrics to track the measurement and say that, after we move to microservices, things are better, and anything on the business outcome side as well. So what benchmarks did you suggest, guys, for companies that are trying to spin off this microservices backend? So yeah, so this question is very specific, right? I mean, meaning like, anything like, maybe one or two metrics, right? Can you concisely say, hey, this is something you can use to say, hey, we gotten better because of this, right?
Yeah, I can go first. So basically, one thing I would say is a usual staple metrics. Right? So you want to be continuously monitoring and measuring your uptime, not at a per service level alone. That is more a L1 or L2 metric, but at a consumer facing level, right? A business request coming in from a consumer, how often is it getting surfaced within acceptable latency limits, in spite of how many ever different services are in the federation layer,
Exactly.
right? So that is a very important metric. The other metric is in terms of your overall resilience. How often do you, I mean, it is also reflected in the uptime metric, but how often do you have post-production bugs that are showing up, which are at a given severity or higher? This decomposition, is it reducing that? And the third metric is a more efficiency or effectiveness metric, I would say, is around time to features, right? Like when you're launching new features, how often are you able to iterate on it very quickly and touch the least amount of components to be able to do that, right? So this will measure how much of automation you have around your regressions and CI/CD.
The last one is my favorite as well, because you can really go pitch that to business and say, hey, look, listen, we can move much faster, right? I gave you a 6-month code, now it's 6 weeks, right? Something like that, you know. Great. Thank you so much, Jay. So I'm just like basically like summarizing things, guys, for the interest of time, because we do want to cover. There's a lot of excitement on the questions, and guys, even if you don't end up answering anything, we'd still summarize some answers over email, guys. One question that Alabsi can take on is how do we transition the database to be ready for the microservices architecture? I think it's a good question, because, you know, starting from one database to, like, you know, you need to put single one for each service. Any thoughts, Alabsi? Especially if you're starting out with one big RDS database and want to have 5 microservices, what do you do?
Sure. You know, an approach that we've tried out in Bukalapak and that worked quite well is to kind of do that in a more of an incremental fashion. So we basically first took a look at the schema that we had in this large monolithic application and saw what we can do to kind of break down that schema into more granular tables, where such tables are going to fit quite well the moment that we break down the application into microservices. The second is that we started out with partitioning the database as well. So that way, you know, we have the kind of scale in place in terms of having enough masters and slaves, having enough partitions in place, such that we can potentially be able to handle the additional load of replicating the data from the existing, I guess we can call it the monolithic database, to the microservice database. And then, you know, what we've typically have done is that once we spin up the microservice database, we basically make that a slave of the existing cluster, and then basically replicate the entire data across. You know, I've seen it done also in terms of you know, some folks would use a data change capture tool that kind of replicates also the changes that happen in production in real time to this new cluster. So that's also like another approach that I've seen people find. But you know, starting with that incremental approach, I think is going to make the migration a lot easier and a lot smoother, and you know, make sure that you're not going to experience a downtime if things are done well.
Great. Thank you so much, Alabsi. Next question would be, you know, can microservices become distributed monolith? Interesting question. I mean, there's a lot of these different terminologies, right? Distributed monolith, microservices. Any thoughts on that? Can microservices become distributed monolith? As in,
I don't know what that means exactly, but I can tell you that there are complexities with having a lot of microservices, and one of the pitfalls that I've seen quite common that teams experience is that the moment that they have a large number of microservices, if there is a customer issue and that customer request goes through a large portion of these microservices, there isn't the right tooling in place to figure out what exactly happened and where in that request flow the issue actually took place. And so really making sure that you have tracing in place, that you have service discoverability is really important, such that you can manage your microservices platform and be able to detect and support your customers in those kind of situations quite efficiently.
Okay, excellent. So Jay, if you want to go around, could you take one more question, Jay?
Sure, absolutely.
Just one, yeah, maybe like 1 or 2 minutes, and you can drop off. This is very nice question, actually. So this person is asking like about communication skills, right? Specifically, when you want to go into lead and beyond. We spoke about a lot of the delegation and other things, and can you elaborate a bit on how much communication skills, quote unquote, matters as opposed to technical ability to get into tech engineering leadership? And yeah, Jay?
Yeah, I think communication skills, I would classify it as one facet of your emotional intelligence, right? So basically, it is a part of how you come across to people that you work with, and people skills are what you kind of call as your emotional intelligence, right? So how well are you able to relate your point of view to somebody who may not have the same background as you, right? So I think when you're a frontline engineer, when you're let's say even a frontline manager, largely spending 90+% of your time with your engineers, speaking the same language, you can go into a lot of details and be able to communicate the point. But let's say when you start having more and more external interface, you're talking to people of different backgrounds, operations, business, and so on and so forth, or finance and others, right? It becomes important for you to abstract and communicate the right things at the right level to folks to still land your point of view. I've seen very often that people tend to communicate exactly in the same way, irrespective of whether they're talking to a CEO or to, let's say, a finance person or a frontline engineer, right? So that obviously is the skill that people need to just pick up.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say, just part of communication skills is being able to do respectful conflict, right? Like being able to disagree with a lot of respect and being able to listen well and understand other person's point of view, and be able to change in sometimes your own stance as well, right? So one phrase I have heard, which is very interesting for me, that has stayed with me, is strong opinions but loosely held. Meaning that you came to your opinion or conclusion based on some rational thinking and some deliberation. So it's not like it's not a loose opinion, it's a strong opinion. But at the same time, it's loosely held. What does it mean? It means that when presented with alternative facts, evidence, etc., from somebody else who's arguing a different point of view, you are able to change your opinion in light of new facts, right? So those are all elements that come into play into what people eventually term as communication skills. So communication skills at the end of the day may be the facade of the whole thing, but underneath it, every aspect of emotional intelligence, adaptability, and personality plays a role as well.
Thanks, Jay. This is really good. So guys, on the recording, please check this out, because it's really a good summary that Jay has given on what comes under the quote unquote communication skills. Because a lot of times I see that it's misinterpreted for just being an extrovert, so the loudest talker, right? And it's really got nothing to do with your language or it's about really the things that Jay put in, right? It has a lot of the aspects which come under this facade of communication skills. Thanks so much, Jay. So Jay and Alabsi, feel free to drop off. I am going to direct the next question at Rajesh, and we're going to continue a bit. Thanks so much, Jay and Alabsi.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful having you here. I know your time is very precious, and thank you so much for doing this for us today. I think the participants would have really enjoyed this, and we were looking forward to revisiting your answers on the recorded sessions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Shiv, and I thanks for inviting me, and I learned a lot from the interaction with my co-panelists as well. So many thanks to them as well from sharing their experiences and helping me learn through that lens also. So many thanks for the invite, and it was a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jay and Alabsi. It was excellent. I think I also got a lot of learnings from your point of view.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Alabsi. Okay. So Rajesh, there's a very interesting question, right? How to join startup as fresher? There's a perception that early stage startups only hire experienced people.
Yeah, that one is a tough one. Honestly, the reality is the need of the hour is also that we need people with skills to come in and deliver fast. So it's possible that, when we are also looking for people as a fresher, if you're also competing with all the people who are experienced, the decision as a hiring manager is a little bit trickier. You're also looking to move fast, get things done, because the main point of a startup is the ability to move fast, get things done. And there's a product market fit that you're trying to get done fairly quickly, right? So obviously there is going to be a little bit of bias in the early stages to look for at least 1 or 2 years experience, right? So when you say experience, complete freshers, but that said, that we'll have internship opportunities also open where we would want to take people, and as we mature, slightly further along, for especially on the point of mentorship, we already touched upon this. We also need to make sure that the person who's coming in is also mentored, right? So if a lot of freshers come, 4 or 5 freshers are coming in, and if freshers are all trying to build the product, who's going to mentor them, right? So we need that mix. One of the things we also look for in a startup is self-starters who can get things done independently, right? So maybe from that point of view, it is slightly trickier, but of course freshers are also welcome. We don't say no, but of course, when you're trying to build up the teams initially, we might prefer slightly more experienced people versus no experience at all.
Sure. So we'll take just 2 more questions. Would you suggest young developers go right into startups or get experience in big tech first? We discussed a bit on this, but maybe something like a meta summary, Rajesh, right? What would you suggest?
So this one I would say is a very personal decision. I will not be able to sort of give a generic answer, but I'll talk about the contours of decision making. If you're a person who's got a high energy, wants to fast track that career, and wants to build things quickly and learn a lot, and likes exploring, right, and wants an accelerated career, and you think you have the energy levels to pull it off, because it is demanding, right? It's not for free, but it also comes with that accelerated career. If that's what you're looking for, then your startups will help you accelerate your career significantly, right? You're like in 10 years, maybe you might be a VP, right? It's possible. There are people who do that, or maybe a CTO, or maybe the starting of a company. Depends on what they're doing, and every individual is different. Whereas in a larger organization, things are a little bit more set. All the level expectations are more set. There's like a tenure. You have to X number of months. You need to get things done. And I've worked. I'm fairly qualified to give this answer because I've spent the first 15 years of my career at Microsoft and Google, large organizations. So I know the drill there. But it's a very different thing. So what do you want? You have to decide as an individual. And I'm hoping a lot of the audience in the session are really folks that have that energy, that passion for startups, and that's kind of where they are. But it's a very individual decision. But for the reasons I mentioned, if you're looking to fast track your career and build out, those would be the reasons to look at a startup.
Okay, and we'll just take one last question, Rajesh. It's also very relevant. How do you guys manage and maintain the stack tools and frameworks in large organization? Do you centralize it with several standards that all engineers must follow? Or in startups, he's asking that the teams manage independently during the startup stage. So with respect to tools and frameworks, right? Yeah, because things shouldn't get chaotic as well. Everybody using their own tools in startups. So Rajesh, from your startup experience, this is very relevant to you, right? Like the recent.
So I would say this depends more on the company. I can give you very specific points. Like for example, Google had a policy where they said these are the 4 blessed technologies, and then if you want to do anything outside of that, you need to get an approval, right? Like some of the startups I worked in, like Ola, one of the things that they had as a policy, they said as long as you can have the lowest common denominator of building to JVM, right? That's good enough, right? So you need to have some semblance of a policy. Obviously, if everybody starts making a decision to go in a different direction, you also need to think practically from one is engineering creativity on one side, but the other side is the practicality of being also able to hire those engineers that you need, right? It's not just about the engineer who built it, it's about the next engineer who comes in, who has to add and contribute. So if you pick some next coolest technology commits happening to that code base, it's going to see the end of life, we don't know what's going to happen, then those are risks that you're kind of taking, right? That said, we do encourage being on the latest, at least at BukuWarung, we have engineers speaking like the latest and greatest technology. That is one thing you can do. I think the Amazon example came up multiple times, and they were even the code base like 20 years old, and they also have Perl code base, right? Because they are not able to get off the legacy. Whereas in the startup, that's the other advantage. Mostly I've found the startups normally have the cutting technology, the latest technology, just because they can do it. They're starting out today, and if they're starting out today, they'll want to pick the next greatest, the best technology, right? So the flexibility is a little bit more. Whereas a larger organization, there's a lot of legacy, so it's not so easy to kind of get off also, right? You need to support that. But picking common things like Java-based things or something Python, so that you can also employ people, right? So it's not just about shooting in the sky. We need to deliver also at the end of the day.
Excellent. So guys, I think we should wrap up now. We've had so for some of the questions that we may have missed or not answered, guys, we'll basically, we have emails of all the participants, and for some relevant questions, we will definitely send out a summary in email. And thank you, Rajesh, for joining us here on this. It was just personally great for me to interact with all of you, and thank you for all your stories about your early days and their experiences.
Yeah, thank you, Shiv. Thank you so much. I think it was very interesting to hear from you and hearing from the other panelists who are also very experienced. I really enjoyed the session. Thank you, guys. I hope our audience also did.
Yeah, and so for the audience, right, one of the things is that, we covered a broad breadth of topics, so please feel free to go over the recording. There's a lot of gems in there, right? It was too much to cover in just an hour. At the same time, you might have questions for, hey, how do I do it at my organization? This thing, like I do see a lot of questions around that. How do I manage the complexity? For example, it's 300 people with microservices. I would say that a lot of the answers to that is really in this, what the panelists have given us here, right? Basically, you need to invest in a lot of resiliency, monitoring tools, right? There is an investment that comes with that. And it's not just a prescriptive thing as well, right? Otherwise, it would be like the prescriptive model, somebody would have it right off the board. So you really need to understand what your business needs are, right? Don't just jump into microservices because somebody told you to, or you got some book, right? So understand your business needs very well. Like, I think one of the things that the panelists summarized was work backwards and see, what business outcome that you can measure, even on the metrics part, like Jay said, right? Like look at the edge, right? Are you reducing your latencies? Are you increasing your delivery of time of your features, or is it just getting more and more complex, right? If it's a reverse, and you're doing well as a monolith, and it takes you 6 months to release a product as a microservice, and it's crashing every day, you may not be doing the right things, right? So it's a very specific contextual thing, and I bless you all on this journey. I've been through that multiple times in my career. I also took a startup Plunge 5 years back from the safe world of eBay and Microsoft to, with relatively young startups in Southeast Asia, which have now scaled up massively, right? So that's the enriching experience you get out of startups, right? You get to see that, hey, I was in this 50-person organization, 100-person organization I'm leading, and now the scale has become massive, right? So this is the rewards of your startup Plunge. And be in it for the journey, guys. So if you want to take one thing away, one thing from me, just be in it for your passion, what you want to do, and that will never fail, right? Be in it for the journey and not for the big fat words. Okay, thank you, guys, and we're going to stop the recording now.